The village of Akip was perched precariously on a jagged hillside, where the sky seemed to open endlessly and pour its sorrows upon the land. Rain fell with a relentless rhythm, drumming on thatched roofs, hammering against clay walls, and soaking the narrow, winding paths that connected the small cluster of homes. Storms rolled over the hills almost every day, sending streams rushing through the village and carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. The villagers moved cautiously, attuned to the rhythm of the weather, for they believed that the rain was more than mere water. It was a messenger, a living thread that connected them to their ancestors. Every droplet was said to hold a memory, a lesson, a warning. When the wind howled through the valley and lightning split the sky, the villagers would whisper prayers, certain that their ancestors were watching, speaking, and remembering through the storm. In the heart of this sodden village lived Zara, a girl of 16, whose presence seemed to radiate warmth despite the perpetual chill of rain. Her hair, black and glossy, often clung to her face, plastered by the storms, and her dark eyes held the quiet depth of someone who had learned to seek hope even when the sky wept ceaselessly. Zara was kind-hearted, gentle, and tender to the creatures and people around her, yet there was a fragility to her that made the villagers watch over her silently, as if afraid that the merciless rain might wash her away entirely. She had grown up under the care of her late mother, and although her mother had passed when Zara was young, her presence lingered in small rituals and whispered prayers. During each downpour, Zara would kneel beside her window or under the sheltering eaves of the baobab near her home, murmuring words she had learned from her mother, calling upon her guidance and protection. She would dip her fingers into rain puddles, letting the water trace shapes upon the earth, imagining the droplets carrying messages to her mother's spirit, messages filled with longing, love, and quiet questions about the hardships of life. It was her secret communion, her fragile anchor amid the torrents, the only comfort she allowed herself in a house where warmth and safety were fleeting. Zara's father, though alive and present in body, had grown distant, distracted by his work and by the counsel of others, especially the woman he had married after her mother's death. Alissa, her stepmother, was striking in appearance, with sharp features and eyes that gleamed with cunning. She could charm a guest at her table with a smile, yet behind that charm lay envy and bitterness as deep as the storm clouds above the village. Zara's beauty, her kindness, and the way the villagers whispered her praises gnawed at Alissa's heart. She had long nurtured a quiet resentment, masking her cruelty behind forced smiles and carefully measured words. To Alissa, Zara's very existence was a challenge, a reminder of a life and love she could never claim. Every whispered prayer that Zara offered to her late mother felt like a defiance to Alissa, a subtle rejection of the authority she had tried to assert in the house. In the evenings, when the storm's fury softened into a persistent drizzle, Alissa would watch Zara from across the room, her mind working in shadows. She would imagine a life where the girl's spirit was broken, her presence erased, and her father's attention and love turned solely toward herself. It was during these quiet, rain-filled nights that the tension in the household thickened like the mist settling over the hills. Zara, unaware of the dark thoughts that churned behind Alissa's eyes, continued her small rituals, her whispered prayers becoming ever more heartfelt. Each droplet that traced her cheek, each gust of wind that tangled her hair, seemed to carry an unspoken promise of protection. And though she did not yet understand it, the storms that battered the village would soon become her armor, forging resilience from the relentless elements that had seemed, until now, like only a threat. The village, too, seemed aware of the growing conflict, as though the land itself mourned and watched with quiet patience. Birds huddled in the gnarled branches of trees, the river swelled higher with each storm, and even the moss-covered stones of the paths glistened with anticipation, silently witnessing the quiet struggle between cruelty and innocence. Zara's bond with her late mother, her gentle spirit, and the unspoken threat of Alissa's envy set the stage for the trials to come. Within the endless rain and storms of Akip, a story of resilience, courage, and the mysterious power of the elements was beginning to unfold, a story that would soon see a girl left to the mercy of the rain, only to discover that it could become the strongest shield she would ever know. The rain that day fell heavier than usual, a relentless cascade that hammered the rooftops and sent rivers of water rushing through the narrow paths of the village. The wind howled like a chorus of unseen voices, and dark clouds hung low, blotting out the sun. Alissa, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph, approached Zara's father in the dim light of the early morning. She wore a mask of concern, her voice soft and coaxing as she spoke of the dangers of raising a child too sheltered from hardship. Zara must learn endurance, she urged, her words laced with subtle manipulation. The storms will not wait for her to grow strong. If she is not tested, she will never survive what life will throw at her. Zara's father, weary and swayed by Alice's persistent insistence, finally agreed, though unease flickered across his face. He had grown distant in recent months, his attention divided between work, the pressures of village life, and the subtle counsel of his new wife. He looked at his daughter, standing small and fragile in the doorway, her cloak soaked through, hair plastered to her face by the rain. "Just a short walk into the forest," he murmured, trying to convince himself as much as her. "A rite of endurance. The elders do it sometimes for children of our village." He handed her a small bundle of bread and water, his hands trembling slightly as if he too feared what might come. Zara, trusting and obedient, nodded, clutching the bundle tightly to her chest. Her stepmother's eyes glittered as she smiled, and for a fleeting moment, Zara thought she saw genuine concern there. She was wrong. The journey into the forest was treacherous. Rain soaked the earth, turning the paths into slippery trails of mud. The trees loomed above her, their branches weighed down with water, dripping onto her shoulders and into her eyes. Every step felt heavier than the last, each gust of wind a whip against her cheeks. The forest, normally a place of curiosity and wonder, now seemed dark and threatening, alive with the hiss of falling water and the distant roar of the swollen river. At a sudden bend near the riverbank, Zara paused, shivering violently, her teeth chattering and her fingers numb. The rain had soaked her cloak, which her mother had once wrapped lovingly around her shoulders during storms, leaving her only partially protected. The bundle of bread and water was damp and sticky in her arms, and the thought of her stepmother's warning, that the forest would teach her endurance, filled her with a mix of fear and disbelief. She realized too late that the walk had been more than a lesson, it was a trap. Her father, under Alice's persuasion, had left her alone, the shadow of the stepmother looming behind the scheme like a storm cloud ready to strike. Trembling, Zara crouched beside the river, letting the small cloak cling to her shoulders. Her body shook from cold, from fear, and from the sense of betrayal that weighed heavier than the rain itself. Yet even in that despair, there was a spark within her, a quiet determination that refused to die. She whispered her mother's name over and over, calling for guidance, comfort, and courage. The rain, though unrelenting, began to feel less like an enemy and more like an attentive companion. Each droplet that hit her cheeks seemed deliberate and protective, as though her mother's spirit or some unseen force had imbued the storm with a consciousness that recognized her plight. Zara's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand, despite the mud sucking at her feet and the icy wind biting her exposed skin. She took one careful step, then another, moving along the riverbank, listening to the roar of the water as if it carried a message. There was confusion in her mind, grief twisting her stomach, and a gnawing fear that the world had turned its back on her. And yet, with every shiver and stumble, she felt a peculiar awareness, a sense that the storm was not entirely against her. The rain seemed to part slightly for her movement, the wind softened its fiercest gusts, and the river's edge offered footing where none should exist. With each cautious step, Zara whispered again to her mother, and the rain seemed to respond, brushing against her face like fingers of encouragement, carrying her whispered words across the forest in a protective embrace. She began to feel a connection she could not explain, a rhythm between herself and the storm. The very elements that were meant to harm her, the wind, the rain, the chilling torrents, were, in a subtle and mysterious way, shielding her, shaping her endurance without her knowing it fully. Though soaked to the bone, trembling and exhausted, Zara's small figure moved with growing steadiness along the riverbank. Her fear and grief were present, heavy as the storm above, but her spirit refused to break. And somewhere deep within the storm, the first signs of an extraordinary bond revealed themselves. The rain, once a symbol of cruelty and abandonment, was beginning to transform into her protector, whispering that even in the darkest moments she was never truly alone. By the time the sun began to fight its way through the heavy clouds, Zara had found a temporary shelter under a cluster of bent trees. Her clothes clung to her, her hair plastered and dripping, yet in her eyes glimmered the quiet fire of resilience. The forest was still vast, still wild and still threatening, but Zara had survived the first trial. The rain, she realized, might no longer be her enemy, and in that realization, a seed of courage took root, preparing her for the trials that would soon demand more than she had ever imagined. The storm showed no mercy that day. Zara stumbled through the forest, the relentless rain soaking her thin cloak and seeping into her bones. Every step was a battle. Muddy roots threatened to twist her ankles, slippery stones lurked beneath the swollen puddles, and branches reached down like grasping hands, scraping her arms and face. Hunger gnawed at her stomach and cold bit into her skin, but she pressed on, driven by a stubborn will she barely understood herself. The forest, usually a place of quiet wonder and secret delights, had transformed into a labyrinth of danger, alive with the roar of rushing water and the whispers of wind through the shaking trees. Zara paused under a gnarled oak trying to catch her breath. Her small body shivered violently, teeth chattering as she drew her knees to her chest. The rain blurred her vision, plastering her hair to her cheeks, but she lifted her head and whispered a prayer she had learned from her mother. "Give me courage, mother. Help me be strong. Let the rain not harm me but teach me." The words felt fragile against the storm's roar, yet repeating them gave her a sense of grounding, a tether to the warmth and wisdom her mother had left behind. She remembered her mother's gentle hands guiding her through difficult days, the lessons of resilience, of listening to nature, and of trusting in unseen forces that watched over the righteous. As she moved again, the storm intensified, the wind lashing her face and bending the trees to angles that seemed impossible. The rain fell in thick sheets, each drop like a tiny hammer striking her skin, yet something strange began to happen. A sharp branch reached toward her, ready to scratch her arm, but as it neared, the raindrops surrounding it seemed to thicken, forming a shimmering veil that softened its impact. Zara blinked, unsure if she had imagined it, but the sense persisted, a subtle, protective pattern in the chaos. She whispered again, almost in disbelief, "Am I imagining you, mother? Are you here?" She took another step, and the cold wind, instead of pushing her backward, swirled around her in a gentle embrace. It guided her along a safer path, bending the reeds and foliage out of her way, and brushing the sharp stones from her feet as if they were aware of her fragile state. She gasped, feeling the first taste of awe mingled with her fear. The storm was no longer just a force of destruction. It was responding to her, testing her, teaching her. Each gust and each raindrop felt intentional, as though the elements themselves were aligning to ensure her survival. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at her still, but Zara's mind sharpened. She remembered her mother's words about strength, that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue in its presence. She spoke softly to herself, whispering prayers and repeating small lessons, letting the rhythm of her voice blend with the rhythm of the rain. Each step became more confident, each breath steadier, and she began to feel something extraordinary. The storm that had seemed like her enemy now felt like a companion. The water that soaked her clothes and chilled her skin became a shield that softened danger. The wind that buffeted her body became a guide showing her safer paths. By the time she reached a small clearing, Zara paused again, soaked and trembling, yet somehow lighter. She lifted her face to the gray sky, letting the rain cascade over her, and a thrill ran through her body, a mixture of triumph, wonder, and cautious understanding. The forest was still wild, still untamed, and still full of danger, but she had survived the first hours of abandonment. More than survival, she had discovered the beginnings of something else. A bond, a strange, mystical connection with the rain and the wind. As the storm raged on around her, Zara felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. The elements that had threatened her, that had seemed so merciless just hours ago, were not simply forces of cruelty. They were shaping her, protecting her, teaching her. With each drop and gust, she sensed a growing strength inside herself, a resilience that was mirrored by the storm. The rain, once a symbol of fear and punishment, was becoming her armor, wrapping around her in ways she did not yet fully understand, preparing her for the trials that lay ahead. And in that realization, the girl who had been abandoned in the storm began to rise, her spirit glinting like sunlight through the dark clouds, ready to face whatever came next. The rain no longer felt like an enemy to Zara. Instead, it became a living presence around her, a teacher and companion that seemed to understand her fears and her needs. Each droplet that splashed against her skin, each gust of wind that tugged at her wet hair, carried lessons hidden within the chaos. She began to notice patterns in the storm, rhythms in the wind that seemed to guide her steps, nudging her away from roots and rocks that would trip her, or bending the branches that threatened to strike. The rain, relentless as it was, seemed to flow with purpose, as though it were whispering secrets of endurance and survival directly into her mind. Zara paused at the edge of a swollen river, the water rushing past in angry torrents, its surface churned by the storm. Normally, this river would have terrified her, but now she felt an odd courage rising within her. She watched how the rain danced on the water, the droplets creating small, shimmering eddies that guided the flow in ways she could almost follow. She stepped carefully onto the slippery stones, feeling the currents and shifts beneath her feet. Her heart pounded, but she moved with a newfound grace, bending with the motion of the river rather than fighting it. One careful step at a time, she crossed safely, the storm seeming to part slightly for her, as if acknowledging her resolve. Every step she took through the forest was a lesson in resilience. The wind tugged at her clothes, threatening to unbalance her, but she learned to lean into it, using its strength to steady herself. Rain soaked her hair, plastering it to her face and neck, and her clothes clung to her body, heavy and uncomfortable, yet she did not mind. She felt a strange lightness beneath the weight, a fire burning in her chest that was stronger than the cold that gnawed at her skin. Fear, which had gripped her so tightly just hours ago, now seemed like a tool she could wield. She could sense it, name it, and bend it into strength. Each shiver, each drop of rain that struck her like a blade was a lesson. How to move with it, how to let it shape her without breaking her, how to survive and even thrive in its presence. Along the way, small miracles began to reveal themselves. A cluster of bright, wild berries glistened on a bush, protected by leaves that shielded them from the storm, and Zara realized she could eat them without fear of poisoning herself. A fallen branch created a temporary bridge over a narrow stream, and as she stepped onto it, the branch held firm as though the forest itself recognized her determination. Animals that usually fled from humans lingered near her path, guiding her toward safer routes or toward shelter beneath broad leaves and dense trees. Even the river seemed to calm slightly when she approached, letting her cross without being swept away. Each small miracle strengthened her belief that the storm was no longer merely a trial, it was an ally, one that demanded attention, respect, and learning. As she walked deeper into the forest, soaked through and clinging to her mother's cloak, her reflection in the shallow pools of water revealed a transformation. Her hair, dark and dripping, framed a face that was no longer fragile. Her eyes burned with a quiet, unwavering determination. Her lips, chapped and pale from cold, set themselves in a line of focus. She was still small and wet, but there was something powerful in her stance, a presence that radiated resilience and courage. The storm, which had once threatened to undo her entirely, had become a mirror to her spirit, shaping her into someone who could endure, adapt, and overcome. From a distance, some villagers watched the young girl from the edges of the forest. They had heard rumors of her abandonment, of the cruelty of her stepmother, and of the storm that had claimed her, or so they thought. Yet there she was, moving through torrents of rain with poise and determination, navigating the forest as if the storm were a path laid out just for her. Whispers began to rise among those who observed her. "The girl of the rain," they said. "She walks with the storm. The storm does not harm her, it bends for her." Awe and curiosity mingled in their voices, carrying the tale back to the village even as Zara remained unaware of the growing legend. Hours passed and the rain continued to pour, yet Zara felt no longer like a victim. The storm had become her teacher, her shield, and her companion. She moved with confidence, trusting the guidance of wind and water. Every obstacle, every gust, every cold drop that struck her skin was now a lesson absorbed into her body and spirit. By the time the sun attempted to pierce the thick gray clouds, Zara had walked for miles, each step reinforcing a truth she had only begun to understand, that what once sought to destroy her, the relentless rain and wind, had become her strength. The forest, the storm, and the rain were no longer threats, but instruments of her transformation. And as she paused once more, lifting her soaked face toward the darkened sky, Zara felt it fully. The rain had become her embrace, her armor, and her power, preparing her for the trials that lay ahead with a quiet, unstoppable force. Alisa paced back and forth in the dim glow of her hut, her face tight with fury. Word had reached her that Zara, the girl she had so cruelly abandoned in the forest, had survived the storm. The news hit her like a strike of lightning, igniting a fear she could barely disguise. Her plan to rid herself of her stepdaughter had failed, and the thought of the villagers discovering her cruelty gnawed at her with relentless intensity. Alice's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as she muttered under her breath, trying to summon a solution, a way to regain control and silence the girl who had so defiantly survived. Driven by desperation, she sought counsel from an old diviner who lived at the edge of the village, a woman whispered to have knowledge of the unseen and the mystical. Alisa approached with false humility, hiding the rage and envy that boiled beneath her calm exterior. The diviner, with eyes like storm clouds themselves, regarded her quietly before speaking. "The girl is not like other children," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "She walks with the Rain Mother. The storms protect her and the elements themselves obey her. To harm her or to block her path would anger forces beyond your control. You tread a dangerous path, woman." Alice's face darkened, her teeth clenched, and she left the diviner's hut with a storm brewing in her chest. She refused to believe that a mere girl could wield such power, or that nature itself could rise in her defense. Yet fear, sharp and insistent, accompanied every step back to her home. Determined not to show weakness, she began spreading lies among the villagers, whispering that Zara had become wild, possessed by spirits, and that anyone who approached her risked disaster. She sent hunters into the forest to capture her, laying traps along the riverbanks, and creating obstacles that would test Zara's endurance. Each plan was meant to intimidate, to corral the girl back under her control, to prevent her from exposing the truth of Alice's cruelty. Zara, unaware of the growing storm of human malice around her, continued her journey through the forest, moving with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. She had felt the rain's guidance in every step, and now it seemed even more alive, protective and intent. When the hunters emerged, their presence threatening and sharp with malice, Zara felt the familiar shiver of fear. But before panic could overtake her, a gust of wind bent the reeds, hiding her from view. Rain fell more heavily between her and the hunters, blurring her shape, masking her movements and softening the impact of the traps set along the path. Every drop seemed to push her forward, every breeze nudged her away from danger, and in the chaos of the storm she slipped past the men unscathed, guided by an invisible hand. This first real confrontation with her stepmother's agents marked a turning point within Zara. She had survived by instinct, yes, but also by connection, by the subtle power that seemed to pulse in the rain and wind. As she moved forward, her voice, small at first, began to rise. She whispered truths to herself and to the storm, words she had long kept hidden in the solitude of forest walks and rain-soaked prayers. "I am not yours to break," she murmured. "I am my own and I will not be silenced." The words, carried on the wind, seemed to gather weight, becoming audible even over the roar of the rain. Each syllable struck the forest with power, and Zara felt her confidence swell. By the time the storm began to soften, she realized something extraordinary. Speaking aloud, speaking her truth into the world, gave her strength the letters, prayers, and whispered invocations alone had never fully conveyed. The rain, once a mere test of survival, now seemed to amplify her courage, carry her words further, and shield her from harm in ways she had only begun to understand. Alice's fury, the hunters, the lies, all of it became irrelevant in the face of this bond, this mystical alliance between the girl and the storm. Zara, soaked, trembling yet emboldened, continued her journey with a new sense of purpose. The forest, the wind, and the rain were no longer merely obstacles. They were allies, protectors, and instruments of her growing power. And as she whispered her truths into the storm, she felt an undeniable certainty. No cruelty, no malice, no stepmother's schemes could ever silence her again. The rain, her enduring companion, had become more than armor. It was her voice, her strength, and her guide toward the destiny she was only beginning to claim. Zara emerged from the forest like a figure carved from the storm itself. Her cloak clung to her soaked frame, hair plastered to her face, and droplets cascaded from her every movement, yet she walked with a confidence that made even the bravest villagers pause. Each step was deliberate, each gaze forward unwavering, as if the rain itself had woven courage into her very bones. The villagers, who had expected a frightened, shivering girl, were met instead with a vision of resilience and quiet power. She moved not as one who had been abandoned, but as someone transformed by the elements, radiant and unafraid. Word of her survival had already spread, carried along by whispers and the murmurs of the rain. Children pressed their faces against mud-splattered windows, elders leaned from porches to catch a glimpse, and even traders passing through the village slowed their carts to witness her approach. Each villager saw the storm differently when it surrounded her, not as a threat, but as a living, protective companion. Raindrops clung to her skin like tiny shields, gusts of wind seemed to steer her along the safest paths, and even the sky, heavy with clouds, appeared to bend subtly around her presence. There was a rhythm to her steps, an energy that vibrated in tandem with the storm, making it clear that she was no ordinary child. Alice, observing from her hut with eyes narrowed into slits, could barely contain her fury and fear. Her schemes had failed. The hunters she had dispatched had returned empty-handed, murmuring about how the girl moved like a shadow, unseen and untouched by danger. She tried to drown her anxiety in lies, calling out to neighbors that Zara was possessed, that the girl had been corrupted by spirits and that her survival was unnatural, dangerous even. But the villagers, who had seen the girl's ordeal with their own eyes, hesitated. There was a new weight in Zara's presence, a mystical aura that no whisper or rumor could overshadow. Her bravery, visible in every soaked, determined step, spoke louder than Alice's deception. As Zara reached the central square, the rain intensified, pounding the clay roofs and pooling along the dirt paths. The villagers watched, holding their breath as she paused and raised her hands toward the sky. The storm, which had raged relentlessly just moments before, seemed to respond to her gesture. Clouds parted slightly above her, letting streams of silvery light cut through the gray expanse. Rain continued to fall around her, yet it veiled her in a protective cascade, as if shielding her from harm while emphasizing her unshakable presence. It was a moment that silenced the crowd, leaving them awed, whispered prayers slipping from lips in wonder and reverence. Children pointed and whispered, "She is blessed, she is a child of the Rain Mother." The elders nodded, recognizing the subtle yet undeniable signs. The storm bent around her, animals and birds paused to watch, and even the gusting wind seemed to hold its breath as she moved. Zara's connection to the elements, forged in the trials of the forest, was now visible to all. Her soaked frame, once a symbol of abandonment and vulnerability, had become a testament to endurance and mystical grace. Alice's attempts to discredit her rang hollow against the spectacle unfolding in the village. Neighbors shook their heads politely and villagers exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. They had witnessed the impossible, the girl who moved through rain and storm untouched, whose spirit seemed aligned with forces far beyond ordinary comprehension. The fear Alice sought to instill in the community dissolved in the presence of Zara's unwavering strength. Raising her hands higher, Zara whispered a quiet blessing to the storm, her voice carried on the wind and mingling with the rhythm of the rain. The droplets sparkled as they fell, illuminating the child and the storm as though each one held a fragment of divine energy. She walked slowly through the square, the storm shaping itself around her, each step a demonstration of mastery, protection and harmony with the elements. The villagers, hearts lifted and eyes wide with awe, began to murmur in hushed tones that this was no ordinary girl. They spoke of her as a symbol of hope, courage and the mystical power of the Rain Mother. By the time Zara reached the edge of the village, soaked to the bone yet radiant and commanding, the crowd had formed a quiet procession of respect and wonder behind her. Alice's rage, like the fading storm clouds, could not touch the truth that now hung visible in the air. Zara was no longer just a girl, she was a force entwined with the rain, a living testament to resilience and divine protection. And as she paused to lift her gaze to the heavens once more, the storm seemed to bow to her presence, acknowledging the child who had been left to die, yet had returned transformed, armored by the very rain that had once threatened to consume her. The village gathered at the central clearing before the day's storm reached its peak, a tense crowd of elders, families and curious onlookers pressing close to witness the confrontation that had been long anticipated. Whispers floated through the damp air, some wary, others hopeful as eyes turned to Zara, standing at the center of the square. Her cloak clung to her skin, sodden from the ongoing downpour, hair plastered to her cheeks, yet her posture was unwavering. The rain fell around her in relentless sheets, but her eyes shone with quiet determination, reflecting the bond she had forged with the storm and the forest beyond. The village chief, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes sharp with both wisdom and concern, stepped forward. "Zara," he called, his voice firm yet fair, "we have heard much of your survival and the strange tales of the forest, but the villagers seek proof that you are not possessed, that you are a child of courage and truth, not of darkness or deceit. Will you stand before the storm and show us your worth?" Zara nodded, taking a deep breath as her gaze swept over the crowd. She could feel the storm's power coursing around her, the rhythm of rain and wind synchronized with her heartbeat. She agreed to the trial, understanding that her connection with the rain, cultivated over days of hardship and revelation, was her strength, and she would demonstrate it without hesitation. With a whispered prayer to her mother, she stepped fully into the torrential downpour, lifting her face to the sky, her wet hair and cloak framing a figure of both vulnerability and resilience. The villagers held their collective breath as the storm intensified, wind howling and lightning streaking across the darkened sky. For a moment, it seemed as though the heavens themselves would test her, but as the first bolt of lightning crackled dangerously near, the storm shifted. Rain fell in patterns that seemed purposeful, shielding Zara from harm. The wind swirled around her, softening the blows of sharp gusts, and hail bounced harmlessly away as if guided by invisible hands. Even the mud and the torrents that had once threatened her movement formed natural channels, allowing her to stand firm and balanced amid the chaos. Every droplet of rain became a protector, every gust of wind a subtle guide, and every flash of lightning a distant light that passed her by without consequence. Zara closed her eyes and whispered a letter to her mother, letting her voice carry with the storm. "Mother, I am here. I'm not broken. I am strong because of you, because of your love and the guidance you left me. Her words, small but unwavering, mingled with the thunder and the rush of rain. The villagers listened in awe, noting how her whispers seemed to resonate across the clearing, carried with clarity by the relentless wind. Even those who had doubted her bravery or questioned her survival felt an undeniable shift. The storm itself had become her ally, visibly bending to her presence, demonstrating her harmony with forces far beyond ordinary understanding. Alisa, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a chill unlike any she had known. She had hoped to intimidate the villagers with her lies, to maintain control by spreading fear of Zara's supposed possession. But the reality unfolding before her eyes was undeniable. The girl she had tried to destroy was not only alive but commanding the elements in ways that could not be dismissed. Her fury and envy surged uncontrollably, her lips pressed in a thin line as she whispered threats that dissolved into the roar of the storm. Then the storm shifted dramatically, as if reacting to Alisa's own malice. A sudden gust of wind tore through her position, hurling loose branches and rain against her, unrelenting and chaotic. Lightning cracked nearer, and the rain stung her skin sharply, a tangible reflection of the cruelty she had attempted to inflict upon Zara. The villagers gasped as Alisa struggled to maintain her footing, her cries of fear lost beneath the howl of the elements. The storm that had shielded Zara now became a mirror of justice, striking down the envy and malice that had threatened to harm an innocent child. Meanwhile, Zara stood calm, her eyes still lifted to the heavens, whispering softly to her mother, feeling the protective power of the rain around her. The storm responded, bending and twisting to ensure her safety, highlighting the truth for all to witness. She was not a victim of witchcraft, nor a child corrupted by dark forces. She was a child of courage, resilience, and the blessing of the Rain Mother, capable of surviving trials that would have broken others. As the rain began to ease slightly, the villagers erupted in murmurs of awe and reverence. Eyes that had once doubted now recognized the undeniable truth. They had witnessed a miracle of endurance and divine protection, a clear vindication of Zara's innocence and strength. Alisa, drenched, humiliated, and defeated, could no longer deny the power that protected the girl she had tried to destroy. The chief stepped forward, voice resonant with authority and respect, acknowledging Zara's bravery before the assembled villagers. In that moment, standing amid the storm that had become her shield, Zara felt a profound sense of triumph. The rain, once a symbol of her abandonment and suffering, had become her armor, her voice, and her testament. The trial had been passed, not through force or defiance alone, but through the quiet, mystical bond she had forged with the storm, a bond that revealed the truth, dispelled lies, and transformed fear into undeniable power. And as the first streaks of sunlight pierced the dispersing clouds, the villagers whispered among themselves, finally understanding that Zara was no ordinary child, but a girl of the rain, chosen and protected by forces far beyond their comprehension. Alisa staggered back, drenched and trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The villagers had seen everything: the unwavering courage of Zara, the protective power of the storm, and the justice the rain had delivered. Every whispered lie, every cruel scheme, every attempt to harm the girl had been exposed in the clearest terms. Her powerlessness became painfully obvious as neighbors and elders alike stared, mouths agape, at the unraveling of her plans. The woman who had once ruled Zara's life with envy and cruelty now faced the undeniable truth of her failure, and the humiliation was total. Some villagers moved closer, their expressions a mixture of judgment and astonishment. Alisa's reputation, carefully constructed over years of manipulation and charm, crumbled before their eyes. Those who had been complicit in her schemes shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the image of the fearsome stepmother with the frightened, dripping figure before them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, about justice, about the cruelty exposed, and about the extraordinary power of the girl she had tried to destroy. Alisa, realizing that escape was her only recourse, fled toward the outskirts of the village, her rage and shame trailing behind her like a storm cloud. Some elders murmured that the forest itself would hold her accountable, that envy and malice never escaped the balance of the elements. Zara's father, who had stood frozen in fear and confusion throughout the ordeal, now stepped forward. His eyes, clouded with guilt and remorse, found his daughters and he bowed his head. "Zara," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I have failed you. I believed lies. I allowed fear and my own pride to blind me to your strength. Forgive me, my child, for I have wronged you." The words hung in the damp air, and for a moment, Zara saw the sorrow and recognition in his eyes, a man finally confronting the consequences of inaction and misplaced trust. Zara approached him slowly, her soaked cloak trailing in the puddles beneath her feet. Her eyes, steady and bright, softened as she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "Father," she said, voice calm yet firm, "I forgive you. But I cannot return to the old home. That life, that fear and the cruelty I endured there, they are behind me now. My place is with the rain, the forest, and the land that has protected me and taught me who I truly am." Her words carried a quiet power, the kind that resonated beyond her small frame, reaching the ears and hearts of all who witnessed the exchange. The villagers, inspired and awed by Zara's resilience, began to honor her in tangible ways. Hands that had once clutched doors in fear now offered timber and clay, working together to build a small, sturdy hut near the sacred riverbank where she had survived the storm. Children watched with bright eyes as elders helped construct a space that would serve as both home and teaching place, a place where Zara could share her wisdom and experiences. The grove nearby, long considered sacred and tied to the whispers of the Rain Mother, became a sanctuary not only for her but for all who sought lessons in courage, endurance and harmony with the elements. As the sun began to pierce the storm clouds, reflecting off the puddles that mirrored her journey, Zara stood at the edge of her new home, the wind tugging gently at her cloak, the rain soft and warm against her skin. She breathed in the earthy scent of wet soil and river water, feeling the pulse of life in every drop, the protection and guidance of the storm still lingering in the air. Her father watched quietly, humbled and grateful, understanding at last the depth of her strength. Zara's eyes lifted to the sky, a silent thank you to the Rain Mother for the trials that had forged her resilience and the elements that had shielded her. Around her, the village began to whisper her name with reverence, honoring not only the girl who had survived the storm but the young woman who had transformed pain into power, fear into courage, and betrayal into a life dedicated to truth, teaching, and harmony with the world. Her place was no longer merely in the village, she was now a child of the land, of the rain, and of the enduring spirit that could never be broken. Zara's new home near the sacred river became more than a refuge, it was a place of learning, growth, and transformation. Each morning she would rise with the sun shimmering through mist-laden clouds, the scent of wet earth filling her lungs as the river's gentle murmur accompanied her movements. She began to gather the village children, those curious and brave enough to approach her, and taught them not only how to survive but how to thrive amid life's challenges. "The storm is not your enemy," she would say, her voice calm yet commanding, carrying over the rhythm of falling rain. "It is your teacher, your shield, your armor. Respect it and it will guide you." Under her guidance, the children learned to move with the rain rather than against it, to feel the wind as a gentle push instead of a threat. They practiced standing in downpours, learning to bend with gusts instead of resisting them, and to use their fear as a tool rather than a burden. Zara would often lead them through the forest after storms, pointing out the signs of nature, how leaves could channel water safely, how roots offered balance on slippery ground, and how streams could be crossed with careful observation rather than reckless haste. Each lesson was steeped not only in practicality but in respect for the natural world and the unseen forces that guided it. The mystical bond Zara had developed with the rain grew stronger with each passing day. Small miracles seemed to follow her presence, subtle but undeniable. Crops near her hut thrived even under heavy rainfall, their roots nourished by waters that elsewhere might have flooded and destroyed. Animals that had once skittishly fled now lingered nearby, guiding children safely through the forest or offering companionship during lessons. The storm itself seemed to move with purpose around her, creating safe passage where danger might have existed and demonstrating the tangible connection she held with the elements. These signs inspired awe among the villagers, who increasingly visited her to seek guidance, blessings, or simply to witness the young woman whose courage had transformed the storms into protection. By her side was Ghanian, her steadfast friend who had remained loyal from the days before the trial. His presence was a quiet affirmation of love and trust that had endured trials, distance, and adversity. Together they walked among the children, teaching, observing, and sharing moments of gentle humor, warmth, and solidarity. Ghanian helped Zara illustrate lessons of courage and empathy, showing that strength was not just a solitary pursuit but one enriched by connection, loyalty, and care for others. The bond between them radiated calm confidence, an unspoken promise that, whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together. Zara's philosophy, honed from her trials and the guidance of the Rain Mother, became the core of her teachings. She emphasized that true strength came not from avoiding the storms of life but from embracing them, learning from them, and transforming fear into armor. Every gust of wind, every drop of rain, she told her students, carries wisdom. If you flee, you miss the lesson. If you embrace it, you gain the power to walk unshaken. Children who had once trembled at the first clap of thunder learned to listen instead, to feel the rhythm of the storm, to respect its power, and to draw courage from its energy. The village began to recognize the tangible effects of Zara's philosophy. Crops prospered, even when weather threatened, and travelers spoke of safe journeys through forests that had previously been treacherous during storms. Tales of her guidance spread to neighboring villages, bringing children and families eager to witness the girl of the rain and learn her ways. Each day reinforced the truth she had discovered through her own trials. Adversity was not to be feared but harnessed. Challenge was not to be avoided but mastered. The rain that had once threatened her life had become her greatest ally, shaping her spirit, guiding her movements, and offering lessons that transcended the physical into the moral and spiritual. As the sun occasionally broke through the clouds, illuminating the glistening foliage and the children's eager faces, Zara stood quietly at the edge of the river, feeling the pulse of life in every droplet and gust of wind. Ghanian stood beside her, hand lightly brushing hers, a reminder of the enduring human connection that complemented her bond with nature. Together, they observed the children practicing the lessons she had imparted, their laughter mingling with the rhythm of the river and the fading patter of rain. In these moments, Zara understood fully that the storms she had endured were not curses but instruments of empowerment. They had forged her resilience, her courage, and her understanding of life's deeper currents. And as she whispered softly to the passing clouds, letting the wind carry her words across the land, she knew that the armor she wore, the bond with the rain, the strength within her spirit, and the wisdom she shared, was unbreakable, preparing the next generation to meet their own storms with unshakable courage and grace.